Crawford County, Arkansas, March 1983. The smell hit Roy Dunbar before he reached the shed door, diesel and cold mud and something absent, a smell that wasn't there anymore, which is its own kind of smell once you know what you're looking for. He was 62 years old and had farmed the same 180 acres of Mulberry River bottom for 37 years. He pressed 2 fingers against the padlock hasp. The hasp hung open. He pushed the door. The shed was empty. Every tank of anhydrous ammonia, every 50-pound bag of diammonium phosphate, 16 tanks and 42 bags gone, $4,180 worth of fertilizer, loaded onto somebody's truck between Friday night and Saturday morning, planting season 11 days away. Roy stood in the empty shed for a moment. His hands were at his sides. He turned around and walked back to the house. He had borrowed $38,000 from First National Bank of Van Buren the previous October. The loan came due in November, after harvest. His 1983 corn crop, 140 acres of river bottom, planted on the same ground his father had farmed since 1931, was the only instrument that could repay that loan. Without fertilizer, the yield projection dropped below what the bank required to release the collateral. Below that threshold, the bank held the option to accelerate the note and call the full balance immediately. Roy had read the loan documents twice. Crawford County Sheriff's Department sent a deputy named Ferris out on Saturday afternoon. Ferris photographed the hasp, wrote down serial numbers from Roy's receipt book, and said he would file the report by Monday. Roy thanked him. Ferris said these things usually went unsolved. That was the question the county would be asking by Monday morning. What does a man plant with when the thieves have taken everything and the bank is already waiting? The Crawford County Extension Office occupied a beige cinder block building on Broadway Street in Van Buren. It was staffed by an agent named Leonard Crow, who had held the position for 9 years and who genuinely knew his soil science. Leonard had a master's degree from the University of Arkansas and a specific conviction, reinforced annually by USDA bulletins, that the correct input ratios for river bottom corn were 120 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, 60 of phosphate, and 40 of potash. These were the numbers. They had been tested. They worked. Roy drove to Van Buren on the Monday after the theft and sat across from Leonard Crow's desk with his receipt book in his lap. He told Leonard what had happened. Leonard leaned back and said, "Roy, I'm sorry to hear that. You have 2 options. You borrow against next year and replant your order, or you call the other suppliers and see what inventory is left this late in the season." Roy asked about alternatives. Leonard said, "What kind of alternatives?" Roy said his father had farmed that bottom ground for 18 years without synthetic nitrogen. He wanted to know whether the Extension Office had information in that direction. Leonard said, "Roy, your father farmed it that way because he had no choice. We have a choice now. Organic systems on river bottom corn in March are a research discussion, not a planting plan. You have 11 days. Roy closed his receipt book. He thanked Leonard and drove home. 3 days later, Leonard Crow mentioned the Dunbar situation at the Crawford County Cooperative Spring Planting meeting at the Ruddy Community Center. He used Roy as an object lesson in fertilizer storage security. He said, and 23 farmers heard him say it, "If that man tries to grow corn on river bottom without his inputs this year, He is going to learn the hard way what the soil can and cannot do on its own. The room went quiet in the particular way that is worse than laughter. Roy was not at the meeting. His neighbor Hap Sturridge was. Hap had farmed the 40 acres north of Roy's fence line for 16 years. He drove home and told his wife what Crow had said. He did not call Roy. He wasn't sure what to say. Roy's legal position, the sheriff's investigation, which moved slowly, a property insurance claim covering only 60% of documented loss, civil litigation against parties unknown, which would cost more to initiate than the fertilizer was worth. He had none of those roads in the time he had. He had something else. In the back bedroom of the farmhouse, on the shelf above the water heater, Roy kept 9 composition notebooks. They had belonged to his father, Clem Dunbar, who had farmed the same 180 acres from 1931 until his death in 1957. Clem had bought the land in a tax sale for $40 an acre when nobody wanted river bottom that flooded every third spring, and he had farmed it through the Depression, through 2 droughts, through 2 consecutive years when commercial fertilizer was financially out of reach. He had written everything down. The notebooks were in pencil, the handwriting small and unhurried, field records, utilitarian and precise. Nitrogen content estimates in crop residue. Clover stand counts per square foot. Soil temperature at seed depth, taken by hand with a $5 thermometer. Clem Dunbar had never attended college. He had attended his own fields for 26 years. The specific entry Roy found on page 47 of Notebook 6, written in November 1942, a protocol for a 2-pass legume green manure system using crimson clover and hairy vetch, seeded the previous fall, terminated at the late flowering stage, specifically when 50% of the crimson clover heads had opened, and turned under exactly 14 days before corn planting. The timing was the difference. Clem had tried terminating at earlier stages and documented the yield penalty. Too early and the nitrogen compounds hadn't reached their peak. Too late and the decomposing material's carbon-to-nitrogen ratio competed with the corn seedlings for available nitrogen during the critical first 3 weeks of growth. Clem had written in the margin, 14 days exact, count from turn-in to planting. Miss it either way and it costs you. Roy had read that notebook before. He had never needed it this way. His cover crop was already in the ground. Roy had seeded crimson clover and hairy vetch on his corn acreage the previous October, as he did every year as his father had done. He rotated the cover crop for soil structure and weed suppression, then terminated it before his chemical inputs went down. The cover crop was the preparation. The fertilizer was the nutrition. The fertilizer was gone. Roy walked his fields on Tuesday morning. The crimson clover stood 8 inches tall in the low spots, 11 in the upland sections. The hairy vetch had sprawled across it in the tangled way it always did in March. He crouched and parted the vetch with both hands and counted the clover heads that had opened. Not yet. 4%. He needed 50. He calculated the date. He walked back to the house. He called no one. Roy's 1952 Farmall M sat in the North Equipment shed. It was red, the specific deep red International harvester used in that era. Not the bright candy apple of restored tractors, but a red that had faded in patches toward rust brown across the hood and bleached nearly to orange on the seat pan. Roy had bought it in 1961 for $210 from the estate of a man named Clifton Bray, who had farmed the next hollow over and had no sons. By 1983, every farmer in Crawford County who had seen it had the same remark: "You ought to retire that old thing." Roy kept the farmall's service log in a 3-ring binder in the equipment shed. Oil changed every 50 hours. Magneto rebuilt in 1974 and 1979. Carburetor cleaned in March and October. Timing checked against a dial indicator every spring. The left rear tire replaced in 1977, the front axle pin in 1980. Everything else was original. The tractor started without hesitation. Bolted to the farmall's 3-point hitch was a 1958 Rosenthal Model 65 manure spreader, a beater chain machine that processed 2 tons of material per pass and spread it 12 feet wide. Roy had acquired the spreader with the tractor in 1961. The beater chain had been replaced once, in 1969. It ran tight. Behind his barn, Roy had 240 tons of composted cattle manure in a windrow. He had accumulated it over 2 years, turning it every 8 weeks, monitoring internal temperature with a long-stem compost thermometer, adding wood ash from his winter stoves at 1 bushel per ton of raw manure at each turn. His father's notebook gave the reason. The ash raised the pH of the pile during decomposition, suppressing nitrogen volatilization and producing finished compost with measurably higher available nitrogen than untreated piles. Clem had tested the difference across 3 consecutive seasons: 11% higher yield on ash-treated plots in 1936, 9% in 1937, 14% in 1938. Consistent across drought and wet years both. Roy ran the numbers. 240 tons across 140 acres was 1.7 tons per acre. At the nitrogen content Clem documented for ash-treated compost, approximately 30 pounds of available nitrogen per ton in the first growing season. That was 51 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. Not the 120 Leonard Crowe specified. 51. The gap was 69 pounds per acre that Roy did not have. He stood in the barn. Then he walked back to Notebook 6. On page 52, Clem had written about inoculants, bacterial cultures applied to legume seed before planting that colonized root nodules and fixed atmospheric nitrogen. The organism was Bradyrhizobium japonicum, available in 1983 from any seed supplier in the county, sold in foil packets for $2 apiece. The crimson clover and hairy vetch in Roy's fields had been inoculated at seeding the previous October. The nodules were there, active, fixing nitrogen into the root mass through winter and early spring. When Roy terminated the cover crop and turned it under at 50% bloom, he would not be burying dead plant material. He would be burying a living nitrogen delivery system at the precise moment it carried its maximum concentration. The nitrogen in the root nodules broke down differently from the nitrogen in above-ground tissue. Faster, more immediately available. Clem had written, the roots give it up first. The tops take 14 days Together they carry the corn through the first 6 weeks if you don't rush the planting. Roy checked the calendar. He checked the field. He waited. On March 19th, Roy drove the farmall down the corn-ground rows and counted clover heads every third pass, stopping and crouching beside the rows in the gray morning light. 41%. On March 21st, he counted again. 53%. He adjusted the farmall's toolbar for 30-inch row centers, the same spacing his father had used, and began turning the cover crop under. The engine note under load had a specific pitch Roy had listened to for 22 years. He could read the soil condition from the tone alone. The river bottom carried more moisture than he preferred, but not enough to smear the soil structure. He worked in low gear, made 28 passes across 2 days. On March 23rd, the cover crop was under, and the field smelled the way his father had described. Green and sharp and fermented, the specific smell of nitrogen releasing from disturbed plant tissue, a smell that has no commercial equivalent. He started the compost application on March 24th. The Rosenthal spreader took the finished material without protest. Roy drove at a walking pace, the beater chain throwing compost 12 feet on either side, the April wind carrying the smell back across him, earthy and salt flat and faintly sweet. He applied 1.7 tons per acre across 140 acres over 4 days. Hap Sturridge watched from his fence line on the 3rd day. He walked over and stood at the field edge while Roy made 3 passes. He said nothing. He walked back. At the feed store in Mulberry on March 29th, Roy bought his corn seed, Pioneer 3183, the same hybrid he had planted for 3 years, bred for bottom ground genetics. He bought his inoculant from the same shelf. Dale Kirby behind the counter said, "I heard you didn't get your fertilizer in this year." Roy said, "No," Dale said, "you're planting anyway." Roy paid for his seed and drove home. He planted on April 4th and 5th, 14 days exactly from cover crop termination. Ground temperature at seed depth measured 52 degrees, 1 degree below what the Pioneer agronomist recommended, but within Clem's range. Plant when the soil smells ready, not when the calendar says. 50 degrees at depth holds. The corn went in. Roy covered his equipment and waited. By the 2nd week of May, the corn stood 12 inches tall in the best sections. Roy walked the rows every 3rd morning, crouching to pull a plant and examine the root mass with his fingers, watching the color of the leaf tissue. He looked for the yellowing at the leaf margins that signals nitrogen deficiency. He saw none. The color was the specific deep blue-green that appeared in a photograph Clem had taped inside the cover of Notebook 3. This is what nitrogen-satisfied corn looks like. If it's lighter than this, you're short. It was not lighter than this. Roy's phone rang on May 14th. The deputy, Farris, said they had a suspect, a man from Scott County found in possession of equipment matching serial numbers from a separate theft in Franklin County. The Crawford County District Attorney's Office was reviewing the combined evidence. Roy said he understood. He thanked Farris, hung up, and noted it in his farm ledger. May 14, 1983. Sheriff's Office, suspect identified. By Memorial Day weekend, Hap Sturridge had taken to pulling over at Roy's field gate and looking for long periods from his truck. The corn was 28 inches tall, uniform in a way that should not have been possible without commercial nitrogen. Hap drove to Mulberry and described what he had seen to Dale Kirby. Dale told two other men at the counter. By the second week of June, the Dunbar field had become a topic of conversation at 3 separate locations in Crawford County, none of which Roy visited. The second week of June brought 11 days without measurable rain. This was the near failure. The subsoil was tightening. Roy's corn had entered its 7th leaf stage, the most nitrogen-demanding period of early growth. If the crop stalled and the available nitrogen that had released from the compost leached below the developing root zone, the loss would not be recoverable. Clem had written about this in Notebook 7. A dry spell at V7 can waste a good compost application if the roots haven't followed the moisture deep. Roy walked the field at dusk on June 19th, the light gone amber and flat across the bottom ground. He drove a soil probe 18 inches down and examined the core in his palm. Moisture still present below the 12-inch mark. The roots had followed it down. The incorporated cover crop residue had created a moisture-retaining layer at 8 to 10 inches he had not accounted for in his projections. He noted it in the margin of Notebook 6, beneath his father's text. June 1983. Dry stretch 11 days. Roots tracked moisture below residue layer. Did not stall. Rain arrived June 21st. 1 3/4 inches overnight. The corn grew 4 inches in the following week. The corn reached 6 feet by the second week of July. Roy walked the rows in the early morning before the heat built, when the air still carried the smell of dew off the leaf surfaces. He noted color, stalk diameter, leaf angle, the specific stiffness of tissue that indicates adequate potassium. His ash-treated compost had supplied it. His father's ratio had supplied it. He said nothing to anyone. The district attorney's office filed charges in the fertilizer theft case on August 3, 1983. The defendant faced counts in both Crawford and Franklin counties. Roy's insurance company settled at 60% of documented loss, $2,508, arriving by check August 17th. He deposited it and recorded it. It was not nothing, but it was not the point. Roy harvested his corn the first week of October. He ran it through the elevator at Van Buren on October 7th and 8th. The gin receipt showed 140 acres at an average yield of 109 bushels per acre. The Crawford County average for irrigated corn in 1983 was 94 bushels per acre. Roy's ground was not irrigated. No extension bulletin produced before that harvest would have predicted that a crop grown without commercial nitrogen or phosphate would exceed the county irrigated average by 15 bushels per acre on unirrigated river bottom. Roy drove home with the ticket on the seat beside him. He walked in. His wife Darlene sat at the kitchen table with coffee. He set the ticket in front of her without a word. She read the number. Then she said, "Your daddy knew." Roy said, "He wrote it all down." He poured himself coffee. They were quiet together in the warm kitchen. Word moved through Crawford County the way it always moved in that country, from one pair of hands to another, at a counter, over a fence, in a parking lot. Hap Sturridge heard the yield number from Dale Kirby at the feed store. He said he did not believe it. Dale showed him the elevator report. Hap was quiet. Then he drove to Roy's farm. He stood at the field gate on a Saturday morning, the stalks cut now, the ground disked, the dark river bottom turned up and resting. He said, "How?" Roy sat sideways in the truck with his boots on the running board and told Hap the essential pieces. The cover crop timing, the ash ratio in the compost, the 14-day window, the nitrogen concentration in the root nodules at peak bloom. He talked for about 15 minutes. Hap listened. When Roy stopped, Hap said, "That's your father's method." Roy said, "That's my father's observation." Hap looked at the disked field. Then he said, "I told people you were going to lose the place." Roy looked at him. He did not say anything. Hap drove away. Leonard Crowe encountered the yield number in early October through the Extension Office's own tracking of public elevator reports. He had 209 farms reporting that year. Roy Dunbar's was the single anomaly. He pulled the data twice. Roy had no commercial fertilizer inputs on record for 1983. The yield was outside every model Leonard had. He drove to the Dunbar farm on October 22nd. Roy was servicing the farmall in the equipment shed, oil change, timing check, pre-winter protocol. Leonard stood in the doorway. October light came in thin and flat. The shed smelled of old metal and motor oil. Roy kept working. Leonard said, "I need to understand what happened in your fields this year." Roy said, "I did what my father did." Leonard said, "Would you be willing to explain it?" Roy set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a shop rag. He said, "I'll show you the notebooks." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Leonard read sections of Notebook 6 and asked specific questions about the inoculant method, the ash ratio, the termination timing, and the reasoning behind it. Roy answered each one. At one point, Leonard sat back and was silent. Then he said, "I told you in March that this was not a planting plan." Roy said, "You did." Leonard said, "I was wrong." Roy said nothing. He refilled Leonard's coffee. In January 1984, the Crawford County Extension Service quarterly newsletter carried a section titled "Biological Nitrogen Management in River Bottom Corn," a field observation, authored by Leonard Crowe. It documented the 1983 results without naming Roy, a producer in the Eastern River Bottom section, and described the protocol in detail. Cover crop species and seeding rates, termination timing at 50% bloom, compost ash ratio, inoculant application. It acknowledged plainly that the approach had produced commercial comparable yields without synthetic nitrogen. It recommended that interested producers contact the Extension Office. It was the first time in Leonard Crowe's 9 years in the position that he had formally acknowledged a pre-chemical era technique as viable production practice. The words in that newsletter had cost him something, not money, but the certainty he had carried into Roy Dunbar's kitchen and out of it in pieces. The following spring, Hap Sturridge seeded crimson clover and hairy vetch on 30 of his 40 acres. Roy told him to count bloom percentage in March and call him with the number. In October 1984, Hap's 30 acres yielded 104 bushels per acre with no commercial nitrogen. He told his wife, and she told 3 women at her church circle, and 2 of those women had husbands who farmed. By 1986, the protocol from Notebook 6 referred to in county extension literature as the river bottom green manure system. With no individual name attached, had been applied on an estimated 420 acres across Crawford, Franklin, Johnson, Sebastian, and Scott counties. 5 districts. Yields on those acres averaged 7% above county norms in favorable seasons and 3% below in dry years, against a baseline of zero synthetic nitrogen cost. A graduate student from the University of Arkansas named Patris Sommer drove to Crawford County in the fall of 1986 to document the system for her master's thesis in agronomy. She found Roy Dunbar's name in the extension records as the originating producer. She knocked on his door. Roy was 65. He showed her the notebooks. She asked if she could photograph the relevant pages. He said she could. She asked if he wanted to be identified in the research. He said, "Use my father's name. He's the one who worked it out." She used Clem Dunbar's name throughout, with a footnote identifying Roy as the practitioner who validated the historical method under modern conditions. Her 1987 thesis contributed to the evidence base for a USDA Cooperative Research Bulletin published in 1989, the first federal agricultural document to formally acknowledge cover crop-based biological nitrogen systems as viable production alternatives on specified soil types. Leonard Crow's name appeared in the acknowledgments as a cooperating county extension agent. It was a small line near the bottom of a page most people never read. Leonard had put himself there by writing the 1984 newsletter when it would have been easier not to. Roy did not read the USDA bulletin. He knew it existed. He continued farming exactly as he had. Roy Dunbar retired from active farming in 1997 at age 76. He leased his fields to his nephew's son, Carter Dunbar, who had grown up watching Roy work and had asked at age 14 to spend a summer helping on the farm. Roy had said yes. Before the first lease season, Roy and Carter walked the full 180 acres together over a September afternoon. Roy pointed out where the soil ran shallow near the east fence, where drainage backed up in the low corner, where the river silt had accumulated to 3 feet of tilth, and where it thinned to 18 inches over a sandstone shelf you could feel through your boot sole. Carter carried his own notebook. At the north end of the field, Roy stopped and pushed his boot into the turned soil. The ground gave under pressure, then held. He said, "This is what your great-grandfather called ready ground. You'll know it when you push it." Carter pushed his own boot in. He felt it. Roy pointed toward the equipment shed. He said, "The farmall is serviced through next spring. The log is in the binder. Follow the schedule exactly." Carter said, "That tractor is 45 years old." Roy said, "It works. Don't fix what works. Understand what works and why it works. That's different." The 1952 Farmall M went with the lease. Carter used it through the 2003 season, then replaced it with a newer machine for primary field work, but kept the farmall running on the same service schedule, dating each service entry beside Roy's earlier ones in the same binder column. The Rosenthal Model 65 was retired in 1999. The beater chain finally worn through after 41 years, but Roy had taped a note to the frame. Model 65, 1958. Beater chain is the wear part. Chain size stamped on drive sprocket. Carter used it to order the replacement for the next spreader he bought. Notebook 6 sat on the same shelf above the water heater. Carter had read it the winter he started farming. He had the same response most people had. Not wonder at the complexity, but wonder at the simplicity. That a man with no formal education in 1942, in a county most people couldn't find on a map, had worked out through patient observation something the rest of American agriculture required 4 more decades and a federal bulletin to formally confirm. Carter asked Roy once why Clem had kept such precise records when most farmers he knew kept none. Roy was on the farmhouse porch in the late afternoon, watching the low sun change the color of the bottom ground the way he had watched it for 50 years, the way it caught the turned soil and made the dark earth look darker, the way it went almost red across the clover stand in October. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because he knew he might not be there to explain it. The 140 acres of corn ground is still in production. The soil at the north end still gives under pressure and holds. The crimson clover and hairy vetch go in every October. The bloom count is taken every March. The 14-day window between termination and planting is still observed, because it still matters, because it has always mattered. Notebook 6 is still on the shelf above the water heater. The pencil handwriting is still legible. The margin note is still there in Clem Dunbar's hand. 14 days exact. Count from turn-in to planting. Miss it either way and it costs you. What Roy Dunbar carried out of that empty shed in March 1983 was not improvisation. It was not resourcefulness under pressure. It was the accumulated observation of a man who understood that knowledge, precisely recorded and maintained with the same discipline as a magneto or a carburetor, does not degrade. The thieves took the fertilizer. They left the notebooks on the shelf above the water heater. They did not know what they were leaving. That was the distance between what was lost that night and what was not.